You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's 7:35 Pacific Daylight Time. It's June 29th, 2023. And we were talking about co-regulating relationships last time, and I wanted to continue with that a little bit. One of the things that we talk about a lot in terms of making relationships work is the fundamentals of that. Do you feel better? Do you feel the same, or do you feel worse? Is always the question I ask, particularly when you're meeting new people. This can also be something that you do with people that you are already committed to in relationship. The co-regulation process that happens between people is automatic. It's largely unconscious, and so it's hard to affect it. Really, the idea is to pay attention to what it is, and then align your energy flows into relationships based like that. This can be a surprising thing to consider after you're already in committed relationships, of course, because that part doesn't change so much. But it is something that you want to be able to pay attention to. Most of the time, we skip over what I consider to be the basics of forming relationships and go right into the middle part of that, which is, does it make sense for you to travel with somebody else because your exploration is aligned enough with their exploration that you can be mutually supportive? Part of that is the level of interest that you have in somebody else's exploration and the interest that they have in yours, so that you're actually in a state of delight and interest when somebody expresses to you what they're finding out about what they need to know, and that you can reciprocate that, or they can reciprocate that for you. But the basics of co-regulating relationships is that without talking about anything in particular, without necessarily even talking, spending time in their electrical field, their energy field, creates an experience of being emotionally regulated, emotionally balanced. This is a process of empathy, really. I like to talk about empathy in three levels. The first is a visceral response to the witnessing of somebody else's physical or emotional pain, a whinginess almost. The second is that you're able to look at people's facial expressions and body language and be able to understand what that is communicating in terms of their internal states. And then the last is what we call compassionate empathy in Buddhism, where you feel a facsimile of what somebody else is feeling in your body that you can touch into. When you have all three of these going, you take in the empathetic experience of someone else, you bring your emotional regulation skills to it, and it's transmitted to them empathetically along with your more regulated emotional state, and that becomes a regulating experience for them, and it's this exchange of energy goes back and forth. The other person who's dysregulated becomes more regulated. But in order for that to happen, really, your conditioning and their conditioning have to mesh well enough that there's a strong empathetic connection, and that connection needs to be regulating. It can be regulating. Sometimes it can have not much of impact on somebody else's system, or that meshing can be dysregulating. So that's what we initially pay attention to. Do they regulate you? Do you regulate them? The next thing you want to know is, do you enjoy taking care of them in a way that they need to feel taken care of? Because if you don't enjoy it, you won't do it enough, and they won't feel taken care of, and they'll complain. And then the last thing you need to know is, do they enjoy taking care of you in a way that you like to be taken care of, so that they do it enough so that you feel taken care of? That is really that core basis of regulating relationships. so that when you get into a distressed place where you can't regulate yourself, you can come rushing back to them, and they won't have to do anything in particular to help you regulate. It's just being in their energy for a period of time that becomes regulating. One of the things that happens quite often when we come back to people dysregulated, we present to them the problem that we're having, that we are assigning the upset to, so the narrative that we create around that. And in a good regulating relationship, the person takes all of that in and just is engaged in the process of regulating, but not in the process of solving the problem. Most of the time, when the emotional regulation process happens, you come back into emotional balance, the attachment system shuts down, the exploration system turns on. They don't need so much help in solving the problem, because then their cognitive capacities are back and they can solve the problem themselves. We often make the mistake of attempting to solve the problem instead of helping them to regulate. And they react with anger because they feel unseen in the moment. You can't get the solution to the problem right, because the solution is helping them to emotionally regulate, not to solve the presenting problem so much. Then if they're regulated again and they need some kind of feedback, when you notice that they're regulated and able to explore again, you can offer that to greater success. But most of the time, when we take at face value the presentation of the problem, when really what's happening is an emotionally dysregulated person who's standing in front of us, they react by feeling unseen in the moment. And actually, they're not wrong. You haven't seen that they're emotionally dysregulated and they can't regulate themselves. And that what they're really asking you to do is help with that. This saves us giving advice which isn't followed. Typically, when they can solve their own problems, they don't need our advice, so they don't follow it. And or having our advice rejected, which also feels unpleasant. Is that making sense? Once you have that core where you're picking people who reliably regulate you, this is really the thing to pay attention to as you're establishing your social network, your regulating social network. We talk about Dunbar's strategy for organizing relationships: A relationships, B relationships, C relationships, D relationships, and in the new research, E relationships. In an A relationship, this is somebody who you commit to taking care of them, and you move your solo exploration into the second position and the needs of the relationship into the primary position. This really brings up the question of managing thirds. Thirds are other people or other activities that you would engage in that conflict with the needs of the relationship. When you make the commitment for an A relationship, you're committing to set aside the secondary explorations and put the needs of the relationship first, mainly managing thirds, so that the solo exploration and relationships with other people come second to the needs of the primary relationship. One of the things about making that level of commitment, and one of the things that happens quite a bit in couples work that I do, is one person has actually made that commitment and the other person actually hasn't made that commitment. And so there's conflict arising all of the time by the unwillingness of one party to actually follow through on that commitment. It's a lot of energy to flow into one relationship, and making that level of commitment is something that both parties need to really engage and follow through on. Not everybody wants that level of commitment. And so A and B relationships are relationships that you tell the other people everything. And what we mean by that is that you give them a complete representation of your experience of the present moment, that they really understand how you're responding to it. And you give them that complete understanding so they really know how you're understanding what's happening. A lot of people like to have be relationships where they're intimate and fully expressive, but the needs of your solo exploration remain primary and the needs of the relationship secondary. Not everybody is monogamous, even though in our culture often that's how it's represented. I think that monogamy and polygamy are a spectrum that's part of your sexual orientation and is quite fixed. So monogamous people really can't move themselves into a more polygamous stance because their nervous systems don't react in that way. They become jealous and possessive and controlling in response to the perception of the loss of that. But that doesn't typically happen with polygamous people. And as long as you can negotiate an agreement in a relationship and both parties keep it, that tends to be a stable approach to being in relationship and having more than one intimate relationship at the same time. So part of this is an exploration of what actually is your setup, what works for you. I know quite a few people who are on the poly side of things who commit to monogamous relationships, and that seems to be workable, but it doesn't really go so well the other way. So in setting up your network of close people, starting with the question, do I feel better? Do I feel the same? Or do I feel worse after spending a half an hour with people? Beginning to organize around yourself relationships which are regulating, so you feel consistently better in just hanging out with somebody. If you need to talk about something specifically, you can do that, but it's unnecessary for the regulating process. If you build a network of people around you that are consistently regulating for you, then you move from contact to contact and are regulated in each of the contacts, which makes for a smoother ride through the vicissitudes of our lives in the West, mainly is where we are. Secure functioning relationships are built on a skill set, which is quite dynamic. The first of the skill set of secure functioning is a coherent narrative. The second is capacity to mentalize, thinking about thinking, we call that. And the third is to see the value of attachment. When we talk about setting up these A and B relationships, we're talking about a huge amount of energy to support them. If you don't see the value of attachment and what you get out of the regulating relationships, it's hard to justify to yourself why you would put that much energy into relationships. Secure functioning relationships require a lot more energy than insecure functioning relationships. One of the things that's hardest for insecurely attached people to move into more secure functioning is the commitment of energies, of time, energy, and resources that it takes to sustain those relationships. Insecure and disorganized people aren't used to getting a lot of support out of the relationships that they have, so they don't flow the amount of energy into them that secure functioning relationships require. So they don't, in some sense, they're self-excluding from secure functioning relationships. So you need to change your mind about that and begin to consider putting energy into relationships. Now, the other thing about insecure and disorganized relationships is that they are not wrong in understanding that they don't provide the level of support that secure functioning relationships do. And so they don't really warrant that energy. But if you don't put that energy into the relationship, you don't have it. So part of it is to begin to see the value of that. In insecure, disorganized relationships, they tend to be more transactional and less collaborative, so that you're constantly paying attention and summing up how you're doing in the relationship in terms of resource expenditure and return. Whereas in secure functioning relationships, which are collaborative rather than transactional, you take on the responsibility of care for the other person, and they take on the responsibility of care for you, and you don't constantly sum up to see whether the transactional agreements have been met or not. There's a commitment to the care of the other. And even if they're temporarily incapacitated and unable to reciprocate that, you're still on the hook for the care because it's a collaborative agreement rather than a transactional one. In insecure relationships, what you notice is that the relationship is constantly threatened when there's an imbalance in the transactional process. I agree to give you this if you do that for me, and if I give you that and you don't do it, the relationship is in danger. Not making sense. So you need to change your mind about the willingness to take care of somebody else. The thing about secure functioning relationships, though, is that they're reliable. People are reliable and they do what they say they're going to do, and they don't do what they say they're not going to do. And this doesn't happen with the same frequency in insecure relationships. So one of the things to watch out for if you're coming from an insecure place moving toward security is that you have to pick people who are trustworthy and who will reciprocate in the way that they say they will. One of the things that happens to insecure and disorganized people is that fourth dimension of empathy, where you're actually comparing what people say they're going to do with what they do, gets split off because it's impossible to sum up what happens in the family system if you compare what people say they're going to do or not do to what they do. So insecure and disorganized people rely more heavily on what people say they're going to do rather than on what they do. And that needs to change. Or what will happen is that you'll rely on somebody who does not follow through, and that little fledgling trust experience that you're trying to build will be disappointing and confirming of the idea that relationships are unreliable. Is that making sense? So part of this process is to go slow in the beginning, to be clear about what your intentions are, to be clear about what your needs are, and pay attention to these little pieces of trust that you hand over to the other person to make sure that they handle them well and meet the obligations that they declare. If they don't meet the obligations in the way that they declare, the secure person actually just adjusts their working model that includes that information, whereas secure people often demand that they follow through on it without adjusting the working model. What can happen then is that over and over again, you're disappointed by the same person not following through on what they're saying. Or you might be the person who doesn't follow through, so they're over and over again disappointed by you not following through. Insecure people, insecurely attached people, dismissing people, and preoccupied people tend to be fairly reliable. It's really disorganized people that are so unreliable. The reason that disorganized people are so unreliable is that they don't mentalize very well, and they're poor emotional regulators, so they can't tell what shape they're going to be in when the time comes to follow through on what they said they would do. And so they often don't follow through. One of the things you'll notice about disorganized people is that they don't really distinguish between the excuse for why they didn't do it and showing up and doing it. They think if they give you a good excuse, that it's the same thing as showing up. And I can assure you in the secure world, they're not even close. If you give a good excuse for not showing up, it doesn't count as showing up. It counts as not showing up. One of the things about secure functioning people is because they've grown up in an environment, so natively secure people, where people are pretty much reliable, their expectation is that you'll be reliable. And if you're not, there's no way that they have to adjust to that. So they just adopt a working model of you that you're not reliable and not somebody that they should flow relational energy into. So disorganized people in particular often express a puzzlement about secure people even existing, because they over and over again exclude themselves from secure functioning relationships by their lack of reliability. Is that making sense? In order to get somebody to trust you, you need to show up reliably. That is to say, you need to do what you say you're going to do and not do what you say you're not going to do. And secure people, just as a matter of fact, are comparing what you say to what you do. They have to match. Whereas insecure people often don't make that comparison. So the first thing you do is find out whether or not somebody's regulating for you. And then the second thing you do is see whether they're reliable by offering them small pieces of trust. So what is that? It's a small piece of trust. Let's have dinner. I'll meet you at the restaurant. And when you get to the restaurant, are they there at the appointed time or not there at the appointed time? If they're there at the appointed time, they're reliable. And if they're not there, it doesn't matter what the excuse is. They're not reliable. In the secure game of one strike reliability, if you mess that up, particularly in the beginning, the relationship doesn't go anywhere from the secure person's side. Is that making sense? In organized, insecure relationships, dismissing and preoccupied relationships, secure people don't have relationships with people that don't collaborate, don't provide a mutuality in the relationship. This is challenging for dismissing people because dismissing people typically don't reciprocate in relationships. They get taken care of, and they trade usually social position, material goods for that care. They don't give of themselves in that way. This is unacceptable to secure people, so they won't enter into a relationship with somebody who's dismissing. Sometimes natively secure people will enter into a relationship with preoccupied people because preoccupied people show up and they want proximity, and that's meaningful to secure people. And so if the preoccupied person feels a sense of connection and safety and reliability in that connection, the preoccupied strategy doesn't activate so much, so it doesn't interfere in the relationship. But what can go wrong there for secure people is that if the preoccupied person is so consistently in pretend mode and the secure person doesn't see through that, when they discover that the preoccupied person has not actually been committed to the relationship, but has been pretending to do that, it really undermines their sense of safety. They don't have a tendency to question everybody's presentation. They just assume that it's authentic. And when they discover that your presentation to them wasn't authentic, and they couldn't tell the difference between an authentic and an inauthentic presentation, they don't have a way of recovering from that. So that's what can go wrong there. Is that making sense? Secure people are able to mentalize at a high level. And if you don't mentalize at a high level, then what you need to do is train mentalizing so that you can keep up with the thought processes of a secure person. In the way that we work with that, we use meditation as a way of developing mentalizing. But there is a scale that we use to evaluate it. It goes from 1 to 9. Coherency means that you're in line with Grice's maxims. Quality means that you tell the truth and you have evidence to support that. Quantity means that you're concise but complete. Dismissing people tend to be incomplete, without evidence, and preoccupied people tend to be too long in the pattern of speech that they use, because they're using speech as a way of continuous proximity, so that they don't want to, and they don't collaborate particularly. The third one is manner, that you're organized and consistent in what you're saying. If you're following the first two, you're telling the truth and you're providing evidence for what you say, and it's organized in such a way that the other person can easily follow and understand that. And also that you match the energy of the conversation. And then the last one is relevance, that you stick to the agreed upon topic. So in secure functioning relationships, you're able to talk through topics that are agreed upon by the people in the relationship. And because you're able to mentalize and emotionally regulate at a good rate, you can go through conflict and come up with solutions to the conflict that work for both parties. In secure functioning relationships, you don't really accept compromises where one person in the relationship feels like they're losing. It's always negotiated to the point of a win-win, where both parties feel good about the solution that's been created, so that both people in the party are willing to follow through with it. So we use Vipassana meditation and the Brahma Viharas for that. So insight meditation and heart practices to develop the capacity to mentalize. What we mean by mentalizing then is that you understand your wish for the communication that you want to make to somebody else. You're able to express that in a way that they can understand what you're meaning. And the way that you understand that is by tracking their reaction to your expression. So you understand what you're trying to communicate. You formulate a way of expressing that you hope will be communicative. And then you monitor their reaction to your communication to make sure that it is communicative. And then you track your own reaction to their response to your communication. If you're doing that and they're doing that, it's likely that you'll be able to understand each other and come to agreements that work between you. Is that making sense? It's very typical for a dismissing person, for instance, to win and actually insist on the other party in the relationship losing because they don't reciprocate. And it makes them feel safe in the relationship. The preoccupied person often doesn't care that they're at a disadvantage in the relationship as long as they get the proximity that they want, so that they're used to that. They, in their childhood experiences, had to abandon their own personal exploration in order to take care of the caregiver so that they would have care. If the roles get reversed between parent and child, as happens in the childhood of people who grow up to be preoccupied, you're very used to having to take care of somebody else, and also very used to the implicit demand that then if you take care of them and then they're okay, that they then take care of you. Disorganized people actually tend to, after their 20s, drift into more and more social isolation because their skill set at making relationships work is poor, and they're fearful of authentic expression. So what you'll notice in the mid to late 30s, disorganized people become more and more socially isolated until they're really living on their own without that social network that we're talking about. In the continuing ongoing unfairness of all of this, secure people, of course, have always valued relationships. They've always put enough energy into relationships. And they've always set up a social network that's robust enough that they feel supported in the things that they want to do. They're less interested in social status and power and remuneration. And so they have a tendency to be engaged in a more ordinary way of being in the world, surrounding themselves with people that they like, and connecting with the activities that they like. Insecure, disorganized people are often driven to succeed at a bigger level than that because they're looking for compensation for the disadvantages of the experiences that they had. Dismissing people in particular are very oriented toward material and social position, mainly because relationships were so painful in their childhoods. They come from these childhoods of profound neglect that they turned away from experiences with people that have a high emotional content to experiences that have a low emotional content, which is more thing-oriented, more position-oriented. Preoccupied people mainly need the proximity because they're external regulators. That is to say, they rely on other people to help them to emotionally regulate. Because they were enmeshed in childhood and the empathetic experience of the other person became the dominant emotional concern, they're used to feeling regulated by regulating someone else and then identifying the empathetic experience of the other person as their own emotions. They feel regulated when the person that they're regulating feels regulated. And they feel dysregulated when they're separated from them because they're left with their own emotional experiences, which they don't tend to take care of very well. So they're often in a state of dysregulation. They don't pay so much attention to whether or not they're regulated or not because they're paying attention to the empathetic experience of other people. And disorganized people typically are so frightened to express themselves that they stay hidden and tend to prefer auto-regulating to co-regulating or external regulation. In order to set up a network of securely functioning relationships around you, you don't have to do the deep work of uprooting your native attachment and changing that. You can simply change the dynamics of the relationships you're in so that they function more securely. So moving from transactional relationships into collaborative relationships where you're committed to taking care of the whole person and not tending to individual transactions, and paying attention to whether they're willing to commit to you in that way and take care of you in a collaborative way. In order for that to work, you have to be willing to express to the other person in an authentic way how you need to be taken care of, and then teach them how to take care of you in a way that's meaningful to you. That puts you in a vulnerable place. So you have to be willing to risk that vulnerability, which means you have a sense of safety in the relationship. This is what makes it particularly difficult for disorganized people who are so fearful they never really feel safe. So you begin by expressing your experience of the present moment to someone else authentically. This does not mean that you need to overshare or expose yourself in a way that could be compromising to you. You just really need to share little by little these authentic expressions of what your experience of the present moment is. And then pay attention to whether that's reciprocated by the other person and that they're expressing themselves authentically. As you take on these little pieces of care for the other person, are they then interested in taking on these small pieces of care for you. And if you notice that they are, and there's enough of a balance to that, you can offer greater and greater pieces of your care to them and see how they do. And in this way, over time, developing a relationship that's caring for each other based on these authentic expressions of what meaningful care is and how to do it. Often when you're coming out of insecure or disorganized relationships, people don't recognize what it is that they need or understand what care would be useful for them. And so this piece is this collaboration where the other person is committed to trying things to see if they're actually landing as caring behavior, and being quite flexible in developing this toolkit of ways to take care of somebody. In secure functioning relationships, of course, you commit to taking care of somebody, you learn how to take care of them, and then you just provide the care when you see that they need that. So you have to learn the telltale signs of somebody and what they need, and then just take on that care for them. One of the things that feels so rewarding in secure functioning relationships is if you have a partner who's sensitively attuned to you and just takes care of you in the way that you need in the moment without you having to repeatedly ask them to do something for them. That you have the sense that they do see you, they do know you, that they do take care of you. And then seeing what energy you have, because really the purpose of this social network is to provide a secure base for you to explore. So there's always this balance between the energy that flows into the maintaining of the secure base and your personal exploration, so that you're out there in the world, going to the edge of where you need to go to find the meaning that you need to find, and then coming back and sharing that with the other person that you're connected to. Children who grow up in secure environments learn to do this as children. They go out and they find something, say a broken bottle cap or a twig that's interesting, and they come running back and they give it to the caregiver, and the caregiver expresses interest in what they found out and inquires what's interesting to the child about that, and the child then has this space to talk about what they found out. And the child learns that as they find something out and it's exciting to them, they can come rushing back to their caregiver, and their caregiver will be interested in that. This doesn't really happen for insecure and disorganized people. Dismissing people are profoundly neglected in childhood, and they don't have that experience of exploring and finding something that's meaningful and then coming back to the caregiver. The caregiver isn't interested in that. The caregiver is interested in the child idealizing the caregiver in such a way that the caregiver feels good about the care that they're providing. And if the caregiver is also rejecting, the child learns to keep secret the things that really matter to them, and to idealize the caregiver and present to the caregiver what the caregiver wants to know. And so part of this process for dismissing people is to take the risk of sharing these secret meanings, these secret explorations to someone else. You do have to pick somebody who will express delight that you've done that, and be interested in that, so that you don't reaffirm the rejection by picking somebody who's going to reject that gesture. We tend to identify and look for people that match the care that we received in our family systems. That if you had a rejecting caregiver, it's not unusual to find a rejecting person to be in relationship to. So part of this is going to be changing that underpinning of relationships, so that you find somebody who is accepting, who is interested, and delighting. Preoccupied people, the difficulty here is the emotional regulation piece, so learning to regulate themselves and then also to learn to explore. Most of the time with preoccupied people, the exploration experiences of childhood have been quite interfered with by the caregivers. So they don't have a good sense of what to do in terms of exploring. And so not only do you have to figure out what to explore, you have to figure out how to explore, so that tends to go a little bit slower. First, discovering how to explore, and then examining what exploration would be meaningful. Is that making sense? So, disorganized people are very fearful about expressing themselves authentically. They're very fearful about exploring. They're poor mentalizers and poor emotional regulators. And so there's a lot of things that have to happen in order to help disorganized people move into earned security. The first piece is to change your mind about attachment, that you can find caring people that have your interest in mind, that will help you, that not everybody is a perpetrator, that not everybody will betray you. This is the nature of the fearfulness of disorganized people, because they're exploited, because they're abused in childhood. They lose a sense of confidence that they can choose people who will be non-harming. So you have to be careful about this and go really slowly and make sure that the people that you pick are not going to betray you. And you do that little by little, offering them pieces of trust. One of the characteristics of disorganized attachment is that any kind of kindness, any kind of attention is so disarming that you rush headlong into overcommitting into relationships without really knowing the person very well, or well enough to know whether or not they'll support you and encourage you in the way that you need. Is that all making sense pretty well? So what you notice in secure functioning relationships that are regulating is that you move from person to person. You have a number of people that can be regulating so that you don't have to rely on only one person. In the West, what typically happens in coupling is you set up one relationship that's reliably regulating and you don't have any others. This is an incredible burden on the one person to be your only source of emotional regulation. You set up a network of people, not that many, 2, 3, 4, 5 people that are reliably regulating, then you have access to regulators whenever you need them. What that does, of course, is save energy that you can then use for exploration. So you're off exploring, enriching your life with the experiences of the things that you need to know, and then you can come rushing back to this group of people that you've gathered around who are really interested in what you're finding out and in your expression of it, and delighting in the fact that you go and do that and come back and share it with them. That's the nature of this. If you're coming from an insecure or disorganized place where you really don't have much of that, then to go slowly and to begin to put people in place, depending on how many you need. So I often hear in the heterosexual world that particularly if you sexualize the relationship early, that the time frame I'm describing is unacceptable. That you you engage in the relationship for 6 months or so before you make any substantial commitments to the relationship, which would even include exclusivity. And then you talk about what each of these levels of commitment mean. One of the things that typically happens is that or at least what I see in the couples work that I do, is that they've each agreed that they're in a committed relationship, but they haven't discussed what being in a committed relationship means. And so each party is operating on their own idea of what the other person is committed to in the relationship, and that they come into conflict frequently because the other person doesn't follow through on the commitments that the other person thinks that they've made, because they haven't really discussed what that commitment means and really agreed to be able to do that. It's fine to commit to something, but if you don't know somebody well enough to know whether or not they can commit to it, what's actually happening there is the relieving of the abandonment anxiety from becoming engaged with somebody else, not with building a substantial, sustainable relationship. So going slowly. At about a year, if you want to begin to make significant commitments to somebody, you should or could know them well enough where that would make sense. But sometimes it takes longer than that, 2 years. Then you make a commitment to somebody that's been thoroughly discussed and that both of you have agreed to, in understanding both who it is that you're committing to and what the commitments are. You can make steps of greater commitment along the way. But how well can you know a person in less than 6 months, realistically? And so what I often find happening is people committing to things and then recognizing either that their partner can't actually keep that commitment or that they don't want to. Then the renegotiation is much more challenging, because the other person then can consider you unreliable for doing that. Is that also making sense? So going slowly, really getting to know who the person is, seeing them in lots of different situations so that you understand how they tend to react to different situations. This is a good indication of their conditioning. And then thoroughly talking through what each level of greater commitment is in the relationship, so that both people really understand what they're committing to, and then also tracking whether the commitment is being maintained by both parties. Is that all making sense? Any questions about that? Maybe we'll do some meditation now.
I have a question.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Got an echo on this end. I
How about-
can first. My computer.
How about now?
Can you hear me?
I can. You froze there for a moment, but you're back.
Okay, good. I have a simple question. When I'm concentrating on see, hear, feel, and I see a person talking, my tendency is to want to say see, hear at the same time.
That's fine, but you could also zoom in on one or the other.
On purpose, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it feels like they're just one thing, like watching a movie. This person's talking and I see them at the same time. So I go, see here.
Okay, that's
But-
fine.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clarify
There's a
that detail.
meditation called the 8 states, where you note them one at a time, see, hear, feel, then you note them in pairs. See, hear, feel, and then you note them as all, if they're all active at the same time and you've zoomed out and are holding the whole space.
Oh, okay. That sounds quite advanced.
Well, you're partly there. You're doing see,
I'm on, right. I'm on my way. I'm on my way.
Good.
All right. Little by little.
Anyone else? We have a level 2 starting on July 7th, which is 10:30 in the morning until 12:30 in the afternoon. It's the first time we've done a class during the day, so if that actually works better for your schedule, just pay attention that that's there. The registration is open for that. We have a level 1 coming up. Let's see, when is that? So the level 1 is starting on August 12th, so I guess that's 6 weeks out. That'll be on Saturday morning. We're doing half days with that. And then we have another level 2, which is going to start on September 21st. So those are the main classes that are coming up. If that's interesting to you, to take a look at it. I offer the class on a Dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. I offer the teachings freely, but I do hope that if you're able to, you'll make a donation to help support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. We really appreciate your practice, though. So if you're not resourced, don't worry about it. Just come and practice with us. Good to see you, and I'll see you soon.
Could you do? I mean, I assume you should do level 1 before 2, but if you wanted to do 2 then 1, is that advisable? I know there's not 2 number 2s coming up.
We don't. So level 1. Here's the question: do you like to jump into the deep end of things, or do you like to stick your toe in the shallow end and inch into the water?
Shallow.
So then level 1 is probably better to start with. But level 2 is just a more intense version of level 1. It's more in depth. It's also slower. So I don't know. I think we mainly do the level 1s to interest people in the topic and give them a sense of the breadth of the topic and what's necessary. But if we've already done that, then level 2 probably would be all right. Your call.
Okay. We're just kind of curious. Okay, thank you.
It's not a prerequisite. Level 1 is not a prerequisite for level 2.
Uh-huh.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
thank you.